School has started and this is the first week of the fall trimester. Now we usually do a figure pose for 5 weeks, but this time it's going to be 2.5 weeks. So I'm not going to be able to get a highly resolved painting like I normally can, but I'm really still pushing to get a really nice painting at the end of this. So on Monday we start the figure pose and our model is drawn and I see what the pose is going to be. And the first thing I do is I do a little pencil drawing of it just to get myself familiar with the pose. And we usually at Ravenswood Atelier, we do a lot of standing poses, and this is a seated pose and I'm really excited to do that because the light arrangement on it is different than what generally we do, because with a standing pose, they stand under the skylight, so the chest will be the brightest part of the figure and then it'll gradate as you go down the body. But in the seated pose, how John is, he has his legs out and his arms out, and the lightest part of him is his legs, and instead of his chest and stomach being really bright like it is a lot of times for standing poses, there's actually a lot of shadow and darker halftones on it. So I am really pretty excited to get to working with the impression with the light shape and shadow shape, because it's something that I'm not used to, so it's exciting that it's new. Also, what I like about this seated poses is that it's something that I'm not used to balance-wise and how the figure will shift and move for standing poses, since I've been doing the majority of my 4 years at Ravenswood, they've been standing poses. So I am pretty familiar with how the body holds itself up and shifts and changes over the feet. So the seated pose, the weight and everything is different. His legs both will swing, and he just will, since then his hips are rested on something, the upper body will move and twist in ways that don't necessarily reflect what's happening with the legs, because they're a little bit separate, because there's the gravity of the feet resting and then his hips instead of just the feet. So it's been interesting, and I've been really conscious of how the body's moving in a seated pose like this. So with working on the pencil drawing, I'm just trying to figure out the pose and get familiar with getting the pose down as simple as possible. And once I felt comfortable with that, I then moved on to my bigger transfer drawing, which is done in charcoal on Canson paper. And Monday I got a nice representation of the pose, I think, that first day. Tuesday I'm working more on the transfer drawing, trying to push it along and make sure it's getting more and more accurate with how I change things and break things up. I am seeing usually with a model, it takes about a week for them, I've noticed, for them to really get into a pose that they're going to stay in for the rest of the time as they figure out what's natural for them to hold, how they hold the pose. And so for John, he did start kind of slouched, but Tuesday he's more consistently straightening up a little bit, so I'm making the necessary changes on my drawing to reflect that. Wednesday, I'm really trying to lock in the pose now because I want to be able to transfer my drawing the next day on Thursday, since I do have a shorter time to work on this painting. So I'm working to try and get it locked in. I'm also noticing that, like on Tuesday, how he straightened up more, his body was shifted more to the left, and now he's putting more weight to the right. So the pose has shifted up and to the right a little bit. So I'm trying to make all the changes so I'm following and chasing the pose. Thursday, I couldn't transfer right away. I still needed to work out some things with John's head. I was getting really frustrated on Wednesday trying to get the head in, and I was finding it very difficult. He does move his head a bit, but so does every model, so I don't think I can really use that as an excuse. I was just struggling with it, but I feel like I got it more solidly down the first part of Thursday. And so once I felt like then the whole pose was locked into where I want it to be, I transferred my charcoal drawing onto my canvas. And then working on the wash, then I mixed up a shadow color, which is a mixture of black, red, and yellow, so it kind of looks like a raw umber color. And I used turpentine and got the wash in, and I'm really focused on getting the impression of the light shape and the shadow shape. And when I'm squinting at the real model John, I'm trying to get my painting to look like that, where it's just the shadow and light effect. So just really trying to get the first impression of light that I see, and I'm trying to get that on my canvas with just using that shadow color. And I'm moving really quickly because I want to get this wash done in one shot. And I'm also noticing today that, so throughout the days, the poses shifted up to a more straight back and to the right. And not only that, but now his shoulders are facing more straight on towards me. And I really like how that looks because his legs go off to the side a bit because they're angled that way. And then with his shoulders being more straight on towards my view, I really like that pose because it's more dynamic and it shows more of a twist. So I just made sure that when I was working on the impression that I was getting the changes, to show the shoulders to be more straight on. So at the end of this day with the figure, I'm really liking how it looks. So I take a photo and I post it to Instagram of this first wash. And about immediately after, my friend Brett, he has a studio that's right next door to the model room, he texted me and said my proportions were off and that the legs looked too small. And as soon as he said that, I went to my painting and I looked at it and I saw exactly what he was talking about. So I took my painting and my transfer drawing and I went over to Brett's studio and we talked about it, and he gave me a really cool tip for that. So he told me I'm looking at my painting, and then if I take my hand and I cover up John's legs in the painting, so all I can see is the upper part of him, so torso and arms and up. The legs are covered with my hand, and he said, imagine then what the legs should look like under your hand. And then once you get that, move your hand away. And I would do that, and imagining the legs, I did see them a lot bigger. And so when I moved my hand away, it was really obvious that the legs were too proportionally small. And then I also reversed that too. So I would look at the legs and cover up the top part of the painting. So I'm just seeing the legs, and then I imagined the pose that John's in. And when I moved my hands away, I was imagining the upper body a lot smaller to match the legs. So I thought that was a pretty good trick. And I definitely see in my transfer drawing, the proportions are more accurate and they make a lot more sense. But when I did my wash with the painting, they just kind of got askew and the legs look smaller than the upper part. And my final critique last year, before summer break, Matt and Magda said something I need to focus on is to not lose the drawing when I'm working on the impression, and vice versa, not to lose the impression when I'm working on the drawing. And I think that's exactly what happened. I was really focused on getting the impression of the light and shadow, and so the drawing kind of slipped away a bit. And that's something that is really tricky, and it's kind of hard for me to understand too, how I keep my brain focused on those two things, because they do seem different. Like maybe one is a bit more emotional, like finding the impression, and then the drawing is maybe a bit more analytical. And Matt said too during that final critique that that's something that everyone kind of struggles with always for painting. So I think what I just need to do is try and be more conscious of that and remember to not lose the drawing when I'm working on the impression, vice versa. So I was really focused on just the impression. So I think when I do another wash or keep working on this, working on the impression or the drawing, but then maybe take a break and try and flip it in my head and make sure that I'm not losing the drawing or the impression either. And then on Friday, John wasn't able to come in that day, so we had another model, Delon, come in for a 3-hour pose, and I did a little pencil drawing of this. Okay, and now on to my afternoon session. I'm working on the pear project, and the pear project is you're going to have 3 paintings at the end of it, of all of one the same exact pear. And so for the first painting of the pear, you paint the pear for 1 week. After that, you put up a fresh piece of canvas, and you do everything that you did painting the pear in one day. And then you put another fresh piece of canvas up, and you take the pear away, and you do it all in one day from memory. So this week I was working on the first part of that, the first painting where you paint the pear in 1 week. So I picked out a pear and I set it up in my light box to try and make it look as beautiful as possible. And I picked out a pear, and the pear that we use are I don't know if are they Bosch pears? They're the brown ones, and those are nice because they have a lot of the flesh tones, and you can get pretty close to the actual color of the pear. We're still using that limited palette of white, black, red, and yellow, which is what I'm using. More specifically, it's Ivory Black, Flake White, Yellow Ochre, and Cadmium Red Light. So Monday, after setting up the pear, I already have on all those 3 pieces of canvas, I already have the same exact imprimatur on them. So on Monday then, I took really soft charcoal and did the drawing of the pear. Tuesday, Magda came by and said, when working on this is the wash stage, and she said, instead of just doing the shadow color for the washes, which is how I usually start paintings, since it's so small and it's just one object, she said, do the shadow color like normal, but once you get that in, to correct the drawing, get a nice wash color that represents the pear and the base that it's sitting on. So, because if I just did a wash with the shadow color, I'd be done really fast. But it's a 3-hour session, and since it is a small painting, I could do the wash with all those colors to get a nice representation to help me with the figuring out the drawing of the pear. And this was a big day for me on Tuesday because I use turpentine, and I feel like I completely understand why people start paintings off with turpentine now. I never really liked using it before. I couldn't get the flow of it right. I feel like I was either had too much turpentine on my brush, so it would be runny, or too dark and inky, like I couldn't get the lines to be, or I couldn't have variation in the lines for the wash as I was putting it down. It was like everything was coming out sharper than what I wanted it to. So instead of using turpentine, in the past I usually just dry brush it on, but with dry brushing it does take a while to get everything to get on there nice and evenly. And also on those days I feel like it's kind of hard to keep building up the paint then on that first day. So I wanted to try to use turpentine again, and honestly I felt more comfortable trying it out because I had just watched the DVD of Max Ginsberg where he does a quick imprimatura, or a quick alla prima portrait painting, and he starts off with using turp. And I think just watching someone paint, not necessarily even having them have dialogue explaining what they're doing, but just watching them, I really learn a lot that way, and just seeing how they handle things, and how it's immediately affecting the painting. So I felt a little bit more comfortable trying the turpentine again. So I did, and what I did was I had a little jar of turpentine. I dipped my brush into it, and then I had a paper towel, and I wiped the bristles on the paper towel so it wasn't too saturated with the turpentine. And then I took my brush and swirled it around in my my shadow color, and I started the wash that way, and I really like the effect. I feel like I got the perfect amount of turpentine that I needed. I got all the shadow shape in, and then I mixed up a color that represented the pear, did the same thing with the turpentine, did the same thing then with the shelf that it's rested on, and that was the only time that I used turpentine. So then I closed the jar up, and as I was correcting all of the shapes of everything, the brush, I never dipped it back into the turpentine. I was just using the straight up paint on my palette, and I really, really liked that because I could get everything in really fast using the turpentine first, and then I felt like it had a nice layer that was really buildable. So I could, like for example, the shadow shape, when it's thinned out with the turpentine, it's not going to be as dark as the paint looks on my palette since it's thinned out. So when I'm not dipping the brush back in the turpentine and I'm just going straight into that dark paint, I could layer it up and get things darker where I wanted to. So it was really fast and really buildable, and now I'm in love with turpentine and I understand why people use it because it's very helpful. Wednesday, I didn't use any turpentine. I made up my paint mixtures. I didn't use any medium and just worked with the straight paint and just trying to get the colors as accurate as possible, trying to get the key right with the lightest lights and darkest darks, and then trying to get all the planes to really make sense. Thursday, same thing. I might have used a little bit of medium in some parts if I needed to build up the paint more, but just focused on the key, trying to get it as colorful as it needs to be, and focusing on the planes and making sure that they're really evident. I'm really surprised with this how colorful I can get the dark halftone, and then in turn get the shadow more colorful, and then with the darker areas of the painting like the shadow and the dark halftone, how I can get the lights to I can use more color in them. So definitely, I feel like I'm starting to understand color more, and I think a lot of this was working on that big J. Solomon copy over summer. Friday, with the pear, I just played around with edge work and still trying to get the planes to make as much sense as possible, bringing out the shelf that it's resting on so it looks like it's coming out and the pear sitting on top of it. And I'm pretty happy with this week of working on the pear. To be honest, it was a little tricky working on this tiny little itty bitty pear for 5 days. So I'm excited to see then on Monday if I can get this done in one shot in one day. So we'll see how that goes.